editor. I want to just thank, before we start, I want to say to all of you that we're very lucky to be able to offer this free to you. And it's the sponsor of this session is Board Effects, which provides software resources for boards. They're very passionate about the work of boards, and their passion about governance guides their software development. Today, I want to introduce before I introduce my co-presenters, I want to point out that we do welcome your tweets throughout and after the session. We want to try to, this material that you'll be seeing today, the presentation will be available after the webinar, so don't ask us that. It will be available after the webinar. We'll put it up within 24 hours, but the more you tweet what the content of the webinar is, the more people will know about it, and the further these ideas will spread. Also, we're going to be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and so you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a place where you can type in questions. Feel free to do that at any point. Vernetta is going to be handling the question period. But you can type them in whenever they occur to you, and she'll choose from among them at the end of the session. So with that, I want to just introduce my two co-presenters, who are two of my favorite women. Anasuya Sengupta is actually on the board of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and she is, I don't know how to explain how special Anasuya is. She's an extraordinarily brilliant human being about issues of social justice and governance and how the two of those two things coalesce. Vernetta Walker is the Vice President of Programs at BoardSource and is also like one of the most curious people that I know about how governance actually works and how we can push the boundaries of that. And Anasuya is going to be talking first. The setup for this is Anasuya will be talking first about general changes in the environment that are pushing shifts in the way we see and experience governance. Vernetta Walker is then going to talk about what BoardSource has been hearing from board members and CEOs about board recruitment and to some extent about board composition. I'm then going to pick the presentation up talking about some alternative ideas about recruitment for boards, and that will be kind of the how-to of the program. And then we want to welcome you guys to just chime in with all of your thoughts and ideas about what the shifts that we're observing mean and what this model might be able to do for not only for boards but for governance in general and nonprofits. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Anasuya, who's going to talk to us about the general governance environment and what we're seeing that's different.
Thanks so much, Ruth, and for your very generous words. I'm really glad to be part of this webinar on board recruitment, which I know is an issue close to all our hearts, and we have over 400 hearts joining us today, so clearly. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, it feels so rare to succeed in recruiting the right people, the people we need to our boards, that it feels almost appropriate. We're doing this webinar on a leap day. So happy 29th February, everyone. But more seriously, though, and Shafak, you could move to the next slide, this is often the difficulty at the core of board recruitment complexity. We seek unicorns to take us into a magical universe, and we find it very hard to acknowledge and deal with the elephants in our current nonprofit jungle. So I'm hoping that the three of us together can help sort of sift through that jungle a little bit. And in order to do that, what I'm going to focus on before Vernetta and Ruth is a framing of board governance, and as Ruth said, a shifting of the expectations around board governance that means that boards need to be ready before they recruit. So I think that the readiness of current boards before they recruit for future boards is a really significant issue, and is one of the key factors around success in recruitment. So moving on to the next slide, we need to acknowledge that there have been some significant moves, some significant changes in governance frames and expectations. I think the most important issue that I feel needs to be made visible, and that is quite the pun, is that tools and practices of transparency have expanded. And transparency has been defined in many ways, as we know, including the perceived quality of intentionally shared information from a sender. But for the purposes of board recruitment, I am talking about the ability of a multi-directional sharing of information between boards, staff, stakeholders, including donors, and most particularly the communities that nonprofits seek to serve. There are many different instances of this expansion of the tools and practices, but three that I think reflect most strongly in who and how we recruit new board members are that there's far greater transparency and participation by communities into decision-making processes of nonprofits. And that is true in different ways across all of our work, and of course is a shift and a process we should be empowering with far greater ability and reason. But at the same time, it means that our community members in various ways are participating in different advisory roles, in strategic consultations, and sometimes, but not often enough, on our boards. And this opens up a nonprofit's work to far greater transparency that you may not be ready for. And that is really important to recognize. Our leadership of a nonprofit may look very different now, historically, than historically, where it looked very different than those of the communities it sought to serve. And I know some of you are thinking, that's still pretty true, and we're going to be talking about that too. So there's, of course, that 20-year-old thing that's been around that has really helped expand, you know, transparency, called the internet. But it's worth remembering that whether it's about tweets or it's about Facebook or it's about Instagram or Snapchat, there are many, many ways in which conversations about governance are happening between people, individuals, communities, and larger forums that are interested in our work. And that is, again, what we seek and hope. And at the same time, it means that we have to be ready for what it, the implications and the consequences of that. And one of the important things to remember in that is that if transparency is about intentional sharing of information, you cannot do without honest sharing of information. And so, you know, spin is not transparency. And sometimes I think we often think about it that way, or we hope it will work. Which brings me to the third related issue, which I've just talked about, that there are many different venues, both offline and online, for transparency. And it means that people express their interest, their commitment, their hopes, their frustration, and sometimes their anger in many different ways at governance practices. And of course, there may not be agreement, and in fact, there rarely is agreement across these multiple perspectives. And this is a very good thing from the point of view of mission. But if a board doesn't understand it, and if it is not able to recruit people who understand it well, a board is likely to be in trouble sooner than later, unfortunately. And that brings me to the other side of the coin around transparency and governance. So while transparency may have expanded in scope and means, accountability, sadly, seems to have remained at legality. And in fact, given that my experience has been in most cases actually outside the US, I feel that in particular in the US, nonprofit practice tends to get very narrowly defined in terms of a legalistic framework. And so if we define accountability as answerability, as the acknowledgement and assumption of responsibility, of taking of responsibility for actions, decisions, policies, and outcomes, then we know that it should be far greater than legality. But we also need to be honest that often it is about legality. So that's a very low bar for governance. In fact, if you look at how we define roles and responsibilities often, we define it pretty much with the mark of a lawyer all over it. Duty of care to the organization, duty of loyalty to the organization, fiduciary stewardship of assets or income or grants of the organization, and compliance to procedures and processes. So then you end up with a very low bar for ethics, and most importantly, I think, risk aversion and compliance become a really low bar for decision making. And I think it's worth remembering that this decision making then tends to be reactive in nature rather than proactive in nature, because compliance is in essence quite a reactive process, and risk aversion can be, in some ways argued for as proactive, but really it is not proactive as much as it is reactive to accountability. And so we're in danger of seeing these duties as best practices when they should in fact be basic practices, necessary but in no way sufficient. And I think the way to remember it is that at the core of what we want accountability to be are expectations of trust. That if we are not in a position for the current board to be trustworthy and to recruit for trustworthiness, then you end up often in this conundrum between transparency and accountability, a stretching, a set of sort of opposing narratives, if you like, and you end up possibly with confusion at best and crisis at worst. And we all know these stories. They've happened to us, or they've happened to other people, and we hope and pray they don't happen to us. And it's because trust has not been gained, and at the worst, trust has actually been lost. Social capital of boards have been lost significantly. So really, no board should be recruiting new members without thinking seriously about this issue. So I have a few thoughts to offer about thinking about this issue, and then moving into the next section of this conversation with Vernetta. So if we can have the next slide. Given that boards' expectations of accountability and transparency are rarely in congruence with communities' expectations of transparency and accountability, I think one of the ways to think about it for a board is, how do we redefine duty of loyalty? So how do we redefine the way that boards work in terms of outcomes, in terms of performance towards loyalty to the mission and loyalty to the communities we serve? We know that boards very rarely, in terms of the time and effort spent on board business, think less about strategy than they think about everyday operations of stuff that, frankly, the nonprofit staff at that organization could do. And in the tech world, which I've sort of been in an interesting sort of side process of being in a tech nonprofit, the tech world calls it bike shedding. So you spend a whole lot of time discussing the difference between a pink bike shed and a purple bike shed without actually discussing whether we need a bike shed at all. So that's often an issue because we know, again, and this is to think about it compassionately, but we know that often board members can find it easier to discuss operations because it's board busyness rather than board business. And board business, the hard, tough work of strategy, of vision, of thinking about what and how to serve our mission better is very difficult to do. And it involves thinking very much about the complexity of our communities and what and how to serve them better. So in fact, as Vernetta will talk about more, Board Sources survey last year showed that over a quarter of nonprofit board directors do not have a deep understanding of the mission and strategy of their organization. Nearly a third are dissatisfied with the board's ability to evaluate organizational performance, and a majority do not believe that their fellow board members are very experienced or engaged in their work. So what happens when we redefine and rethink of loyalty as loyalty to mission and to the communities we serve? I would argue that then we would be recruiting for values. And values, I think, would be then at the core of our practice and of our outcomes, because we would then be recruiting for diversity of identity, of perspective, of experience, and context from the point of view of experience, of understanding, of where people come from and what they bring in terms of skills. And we would also be recruiting for how these values are practiced, in fact, most importantly, in conflict or in crisis. And when we think about recruiting for community members on boards, it would also mean that we recognize that communities are not homogeneous, that our communities have very many different identities and perspectives and contexts and experiences. And we need to remember, I think, that nonprofit boards at the end of the day should be working with communities rather than for them. There's a shift in that framing of what the organization does as well. So at the end of the day, I think looking at governance is about trust, and therefore it means it is about how you act as a board is as important, and in some cases even more important than what you do. I think for most communities and stakeholders, and this can be from donors to other nonprofits who care about us, and of course to our community members, there is a way in which the practice of courageous vulnerability is far better than seemingly decisive actions that are taken opaquely or with insufficient rationale. And I really think that possibly framing board readiness in this way for governance will help us find those unicorns. Befriending the elephants might help us find the unicorns. Over to you, Vernetta.
Thank you, Anasuya. You know, I so wanted to take issue with you when you said that accountability amounting to legality set such a low bar. The lawyer in me wanted to say, no, that's not a low bar, it's good. But I couldn't take issue with you because as you went on to explain your point about how that results in us really being reactive, not being the best strategist for the organization or for the mission. Enough said. Good point. So at BoardSource, as an organization that works with a number of nonprofit organizations, we get to hear from them and we tap into them. We want to know what's going on. And I can appreciate definitely the desire of boards and CEOs to get this right, to do a better job when it comes to recruiting. We definitely want boards to feel confident that they have the individuals they need to move the organization forward. But our research, as you started to say, indicates otherwise. So let's go to the next slide. A couple of things that we know, and this comes straight from our report, our survey. It's called Leading with Intent. You can download it for free at leadingwithintent.org, free. So only 1 in 5 CEOs strongly agree that they have the right board members. Oh my gosh, we could do better. We can definitely do better. We asked a question, well actually we asked several questions on leading intent and leading with intent, but one of the questions is, what impact does your board have on the overall effectiveness of your organization's performance? And those saying positive or even moderately positive, that was only 2/3. So when we think about the work that our organizations are doing and how we need board members to add value, it really says something to what is the quality of the individuals that we're bringing in. Are we getting the right people? Let's go to the next slide. 58%
say it's difficult to find people. And this number is on the rise. If we look at just as recently as 2012, that number was only 44%. So since it's not getting any easier to find people, this also begs the question for me, what are our processes? You alluded to the need to bring the community in, to work with the community, not just for the community, and that's a shift. But if we're not getting the results that we need, we definitely have to think differently about what we're doing and how we're doing it. As you can see from this slide, the top criteria, according to CEOs and board chairs when they're recruiting, is passion for the mission. That's really important. I get it. We need passion for the mission to be able, we need passion for the mission, but we need more than that. If we're going to be strategic, help set direction, ensure organizational relevance, sustainability, and provide fiduciary oversight, not just the legal stuff, but when I talk about setting direction, I'm thinking about the foresight that's needed, that ability to reach out and really understand the communities that we're serving. So it's important to note that even on this slide, community connections is the second highest rated criteria, but we're still missing something here. So I'm thinking about your comment, Anasuya, as you talked about loyalty to the communities that we serve. So while that's the second highest rated criteria, obviously we're not really tapping into it. We're not tapping into the community connections to ensure that our boards are inclusive. And that's going to lead me to the next slide. Next slide. Changing demographics. We all know it. We've all seen it. And when you look at this slide, it's pretty clear. When I think about how our communities are changing in this country, I know you do a lot of international work, Anasuya, but at least here, changing rapidly. And we can see that our nonprofit boards are still predominantly white, with 25% self-reporting that they are all white. In terms of gender, we're doing a good job. I'm not going to complain about that. Almost half female, half men. And the majority of our board members are over the age of 50. We have a lot more to do in terms of making sure that we have individuals from multiple generations helping to provide leadership. I say all that to say we have room for improvement. Next slide. In terms of room for improvement, one of the questions that we ask in Leading with Intent is, how satisfied are you with age diversity, gender diversity, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic diversity, LGBTQ, and diversity for persons with disabilities? And the area that CEOs pointed out as being least satisfied is racial and ethnic diversity. And in that respect, I mean, that is the greatest gap, 69% of them saying they are not satisfied. So is the quality of our boards, or lack thereof, largely a result of having self-perpetuating boards? This is a question that we've raised previously. I know it's been raised by Nonprofit Quarterly. So I come back to this every now and then. I know Ruth said I'm curious. I ask a lot. I always ask more questions than I answer, and that's because I'm not willing to paint every nonprofit organization with, one broad stroke. I've seen a lot of organizations that are doing great things, but when we look at the numbers, just these percentages tell us that we're not hitting the mark. So it's definitely time to think differently, and this notion of self-perpetuating boards, since the majority of boards, and you'll see next slide, 2/3 of them are self-perpetuating. When you're recruiting within your inner circles and from your social circles and acquaintances, and we're starting out with boards that are 80% Caucasian, then how are we ever, how do we break that vicious cycle? The quote on this slide comes out of Leading with Intent, and I think it really speaks volumes. Board members have no one to blame but themselves if the board does not have the right board members. Either the process is flawed or implementation falls short. Bottom line is, we can change this. I have no doubt about that, but we have to stop operating on autopilot, take a step back, reflect on what we're doing, reflect on what we need, and ask some different questions. Which brings me back to where I started. What, if anything, should boards be doing differently? How do we get boards to examine their recruitment practices and shake things up? And what can boards do to become more inclusive and develop board pipelines that will allow the organization to test, educate, and orient its future leaders? So with that, Ruth, I think I've teed you up.
That's great. Thank you, Vernetta. We don't need this right now. You can go back, Shafak, to the last slide. I've been around about, I don't know, 40 or 50 years working in this sector. I know that's horrible to admit, but and after all that time, I have to say that I don't find very many conversations more repetitive than the conversations people have about recruiting board members. They are in like this constant loop of, oh, we didn't do such a good job, we need to do a better job the next time, let's do this. And it reminds me a lot of an article that Bill Ryan and a couple of other folk wrote a number of years ago called Problem Boards or Board Problem. And what they were basically saying within that article was, maybe it's not your problem as a nonprofit boards and CEOs that you're not getting this model right. That, the assumption is if you were doing all of the things that people have been telling you to do all these years, somehow your board would look the way you want it to. And in that article, they said, maybe not. Maybe the premises are all wrong. Maybe all that normative kinds of prescription that you've been given all of these years is just not very well thought through, not based in research. And that even if you did a very perfect job of implementing, you might fall short of where you really wanted to be. And so taking that as a possibility, let's just take that as a possibility, I think we can talk a little bit about maybe backing up some and tearing down some of the preconceived notions we have about what we're doing in governance and in boards and begin to rebuild on the basis of some new assumptions. The problem again is may not be with the implementation. It's with something very different. I've been talking to people for years about the fact that these conversations are so repetitive. And right before we did this webinar, I got a couple of queries from people that reminded me of just how significant that constant conversation and the loop that we're in is. And one of the questions was, what should I say to my ED? She wants to change from a fundraising board to from a working board to a fundraising board. And I'm like, that question makes absolutely no sense to me because that's not the point. I think that, we can recruit for fundraising capacity. We can recruit for the ability to look at operations more significantly. We can recruit for the ability to look at policy more significantly. But there's, working board and fundraising board are not an either-or proposition. So I want to talk for a little bit about what is really true in the kind of governance environment. And let's go first to the next slide. these are, you know, I checked in with a couple of other people who are big thinkers in governance about whether I had this right. I said, are there really this few ways of peopling boards? The last person I talked to, David Wren, said, yep, that's kind of it. These are the big buckets. So the ways of peopling nonprofit boards are to elect board members, appoint or partially appoint board members. So, you know, that you'll have a certain number of board members that are appointed in an organization where you have either elected members or self-perpetuating board. Or self-perpetuating, which is where the boards nominate other people and bring them in. And then you've got the hybrids, which are combinations of all of those. As Vernetta said, the self-perpetuating tends to be the dominant form of peopling boards. And so that's what I'm really going to be talking about today. I'm not going to talk about elected and appointed boards. I'm going to be really mostly talking about self-perpetuating boards. So moving on from that is to the next, okay. The traditional approaches to recruitment in self-perpetuating boards. And, you know, I think of these as a bunch of lily pads that nonprofit boards and CEOs jump from one to another in the same small pond constantly. Very often I'll be talking to a board that's unhappy with the way it's been functioning, and I'll say to them, well, what do you think you need to do about it? And they say, oh, well, the next time we're going to really get down to the skills matrix and really, you know, recruit for people's skills, as if that's going to kind of answer all of their problems. In some cases, people think they just need to look at the communities that comprise what they can see of their stakeholder environment and just, you know, kind of reach out to one or another person that is not necessarily representative of the community, but a member of that community. And then third is connections to money and influence. And this is a big one, and it's a kind of a pipe dream for a lot of organizations. It doesn't necessarily work out the way that you think it's going to. And then in some cases, you've got kind of all of the above approaches functioning at the same time in the same board. And you'll just have that conversation, doing the loop, the lily pads. You'll sit here one time and you'll sit here another, and everybody's kind of like doing the best they can with what they got. And the problem is with all of this is that this is the same conversation that has been going on for the entire 40 or 50 years that I have been working with boards in the sector or being on boards in the sector. It has not worked real well throughout that period of time, at least for some organizations. For some organizations, it works. So let's talk for a minute, just at least in terms of the connections, because there is research on some of this stuff that is useful. David Renz and Bob Herman years ago did a research study where they looked particularly at human services organizations to see whether if they recruited for connections to money, if their budgets would go up. You know, would that in fact result in more money? And in fact, it was a reverse correlation. For human services organizations, at least in the study they did, the budgets went down for whatever reason. Now, in some cases, it does work for big arts organizations. It works for certain kinds of organizations, at least in terms of building the finances. But even if you were to say the only purpose of a board is to raise money for this organization, that may be the wrong way to go. So is it a fundraising board? I don't know. You could think of it that way. That was your intention, but it may not, in effect, work that way. The same thing is true about the skills matrix. There was some research done years ago by a group of researchers that called the boards that are set up around skills matrices, which is, you know, one lawyer, one marketing person, one accountant, you know, one of everything, that basically you end up with a group of what they called MAPs, which is middle-aged professionals. And each of those middle-aged professionals brings a skill set that they believe is why you asked them into the group. And so they come at conversations on the board from that skill set because that's what they believe you value about them. And so it actually creates a lack of cohesion in the board that's very distressing to organizations. They won't understand, why isn't this board pulling together? Well, the board never had necessarily something that bonded them significantly together. They were asked to be on the board. They may or may not have a significant commitment to the area of work or to this particular organization. You know, it's a quandary. And so when people get disappointed about these kinds of things, it's not because you've done it wrong. It's because nobody's ever proven that that's the right way to go about things. Okay, I want to move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is where we go into, you know, kind of what is it that we're looking at when we look at a self-perpetuating board within a stakeholder environment. And I want to be clear about something. When we talk about boards and we talk about governance, those are two different things. The board is a part of the governance of an organization, but an organization's governance is much bigger than the board. It involves a lot of people that you know have something to say about what you do. So it involves your funders. It might involve your regulators. It also involves your community members and various other, you know, your partner organizations, various other people that you have to, in fact, deal with because they have some stake in what it is that you're doing. So your environment is relatively large, that stakeholder environment. Those guys cannot look like your governance system until you do something that makes them mad. And then they will let you know that they are your governance system. And this has been happening with more and more frequency. Anybody that's been watching the cases of places like Sweetbriar College or the state of Indiana when it tried to pass a law that you know, that would have restricted responses to discrimination against LGBTQ populations, those kinds of things. You can see when that group gets mobilized that it in fact was there all the time. It was not inserting itself, but it was present and it was interested in you. And at the point when you do something that really rips them, they're going to make themselves heard. And the fact of the matter is now, when Anasuya said, well, you know, we have the internet now, that's no small thing, because where before in a place like the Minnesota Orchestra, where you had the musicians who were having problems with the organization, and then you had donors and you had elected officials, and you know, you had these various stakeholders, the people who went to the opera, the sponsors, whatever. Those people are now able to get in touch with each other very quickly and to understand what they have as common ground, and then to figure out how they can push their common agenda. And it's no small thing that we're in a different governance environment. We very much are. These people were always in our realm. They were always around us, but never necessarily felt like they could weigh in effectively or had a right to. And as Anasuya says, you know, the expectations for transparency now are much greater. So in this case, you have a self-perpetuating board in this large governance environment. And you have the board itself, when it goes out and looks to nominate other people for the board, it'll go to basically two groups of people. One is friends of the board, people you know, people who are in your social circle. And that's how we see the lack of diversity kind of repeating itself over time. The age, kind of the stagnancy in terms of age groups and that kind of thing. And then you have desired disconnected individual people that aren't necessarily even in any of your stakeholder groups, but are people that meet your skills matrix or meet your connections matrix or something like that. That for some reason look to you like they might be good to bring in. These people, the problem with doing it this way is that in many cases it leaves out many people, the consideration of many people who have the energy and the commitment to participate in some way in a governance system. It keeps the board group small, keeps the decision-making group small, and it keeps because that group is small, it keeps the number of people who will be identified by it fairly small and looking very much like the board itself. Now, can we go to the next slide? This is what we're suggesting, and it's some form of this that you may want to consider. Those stakeholders all around your organization are becoming more and more obvious to you. If you've got a Facebook page up, if you're involving yourselves in discussions at all in your in your governance realm, you're going to know who's out there. More and more you'll get a sense of the many people who are out there who are interested in the organization. Those people are kind of just sitting around waiting to be asked to do things. The question is, do you want to immediately ask them on the board? Well, who knows? I mean, do they have the skill set? Do they have the commitment for this particular role? Are they somebody who will react out of anger when somebody disagrees with them? Are they somebody who will be able to be in conflict over a period of time and work things through? I mean, the problem with reaching out to people that we don't know or we haven't tested in the decision making of a particular group is we have absolutely no idea how they will function within the core decision making. And to me, it's almost next to insane to ask somebody into your core decision making group when you don't know how they function in group settings over time and when conflict is there and when you've got differences. So the design that we've been suggesting to people is that you look at the board actually not taking all of the decisions in front of it on itself, but thinking carefully about how can we develop other kinds of decision-making committees and entities that will allow people to get into some of the questions of the organization in a really active way. So essentially the way this works with ad hoc committees is that you set up the board itself. As you'll see, there's a arrow that goes from the board to the ad hoc committee. The board members set up committees to deal with time-limited critical problems of the organization. That committee is peopled not only by the board member who helps to kind of facilitate it, but also by stakeholders that you think could be useful in this particular situation. And by organizational staff. So these are staff, board staff and other committees, basically, that are set up to not to make decisions, but to make recommendations back to the board. in each of those committees, you will have people getting to know the way each other function. The people in those committees will be understanding the variables in those critical, in the critical questions. They'll understand the values of the organization, some of the ways that the organization thinks about its mission and its constituency, and to some extent it gives them a deep dive into the life of the organization without having to ask people onto the board immediately. It creates a pool around you, in other words, of people who you have been able to observe in terms of their commitment and their style and their ethics over time, so that as you can actually pull from the best of the best. And for organizations that have done this that I know, they're always surprised at the degree to which they do not get turned down. I mean, that people are, in fact, very willing to act on committees where they wouldn't be willing to get on a board because they don't necessarily see themselves as having the time, wanting to make the permanent commitment, any of that. But they might be willing to sit on a committee for a couple of months to work out a particular question that they have some expertise in. Okay, can we go to the next slide? I wanted to give you guys some, examples of how this could work in terms of the questions that you would put into committees. So this is a health center, and the questions that it may be dealing with is, how do we improve cultural competency or do outreach to a newcomer community when, in fact, our community is changing? One organization that I worked with years ago, their community changed within a very short period of time to primarily Jewish to primarily Caribbean Black. And then the question is, how do we understand the best possible ways to address those communities and involve them over time and serve them? Landscaping an external look of the organization. This is, when you do things like that, it's great because you'll start involving people who have craft skills, who have the ability to actually help you as you move forward, maybe do some things on your facilities that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So all of this is not just about trying to figure out whether these people will work well on your board, but every touch that you do in terms of involving people and engaging people in your decision making, people are going to feel like they have a stake in you. And they're going to stay to some extent involved with you if you put any effort into it at all. That brings you power, intelligence, energy, all, connections, all of the things that you could possibly want. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, this is ad hoc committees at a food bank, and as you can see, the same thing. They may be very different questions, but they're questions that would come up in the managing of a food bank right now. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. Uh-oh, I'm way late. Oh my God. Okay, sorry, I'm so sorry. The result of all of this is that board members have been vetted for behavior and joint decision making. They understand the values and variables of the organization. A larger scheme of stakeholder engagement brings a broader intelligence and more human capital, more rational and judicious way of choosing the best possible core decision makers, and it brings you a realized sense that there's a larger body of stakeholders out there that have power, that may support and enliven or organize against the board's decisions. And that's a very real consideration. And the next slide. How do you get from one place to another? You have to prep your board for this model and prep the board for engagement as a core competency on the board. Ensure that the board really regularly identifies critical questions and thinks about how can we make sure that we're putting as many of those questions out into committees as we can. have board and staff members take on development of the committees, et cetera, et cetera. And that's it. I wanna stop there and go to Vernetta, because I imagine there are some questions there. I feel like I ended up rushing through my stuff and took way too long, which is, a conundrum that I don't quite understand.
There's a lot to say on this topic, and there are some great questions coming in. I know we're not going to get to all of them here, but I did flag a few of them. Let me start with this one, and either one of you can answer. Sometimes it's the community that's less participative. How do you get the community to be involved in recruiting or even these committees that we're talking about?
Well, I know one executive director that just made telephone calls to everybody she could think of that might be in any way open. It may look like a community is less participative if you're not asking them individually, will you just do this with us? Will you come over just this one time? Because it's, for all of us, it's a gradual trust building thing that we do with any organization. I think we want to take a chance to feel out what are they going to feel like to me, be like to me.
I think that's right, and just to add, I think it's often important for us, especially as nonprofit mission-oriented organizations, to be talking to those community members who feel more silent to us, because there's very much a tendency for us to listen to a visible, vocal minority of community members. And to add to what Ruth said, there are many different ways of convening around active engagement, and there are many different ways of inviting to those venues of active engagement. But if the more silent of your community doesn't feel invited, doesn't feel like they can be part of those venues, then they're not going to feel that sense of trust and that sense of commitment to the work that is being done with them.
Okay, so this isn't a follow-up from the same person, but a different one that I think dovetails on that. So let's say you've reached out, you get them in, and this question is, if you can't get your board members to be active and responsive, how do you expect that we get individuals that are non-board members to really be engaged in governance? For example, those that are non-board members who are on resource development expect that the board itself, okay, it goes on and on. Bottom line, how do you get non-board members really engaged?
Okay, so there's two ways you can look at this. You can look at it from a point of scarcity, which is not true, or a point of abundance. My sense is that if you look at your governance environment from a point of abundance, that I actually think there is a lot of energy and an interest out there. It's amazing what pops up in response to that. So that would be, I think it's very much in your attitude about what is it that you expect to be responded. How do you expect to be responded to?
Okay. So I have another one. Looking at the time, I want to try to get to as many of these as possible. How do you recommend dealing with economic diversity when there's a price tag for being on many boards? Are you arguing against board members having an amount to give themselves in addition to getting? So let's say we're bringing them in through this committee process with the hopes that they'll eventually become board members, and we're reaching out into the community. We want all kinds of diversity and inclusion. So how do you deal with economic diversity in that case?
Do you want to go for that, Anasuya?
I can go for that, but I would also love to hear Vernetta's thoughts on it, because I'm sure that at board source you're thinking about it. So yes, the great pay-to-play problem. I think there is a way in which you're paying to play, but it's not about payment in terms of money. That depending on your economic status, there are many different ways to offer your skills, your time, your energy to boards that are beyond what you can offer in terms of funds. And I think boards need to value these different ways of engaging as much as the funds that they bring. And just as Ruth said, the research shows that the funds that you bring may not actually lead to better performance on boards. So I think valuation is important. The question is, what do we value?
Okay. You know, I love Kim Klein's answer around this. She says it's important for everybody on a board to give something, but $10 to me, maybe your $100. And so, you know, if we really want economic diversity, we have to be real about what that means. You know, you can't, you know, what principle are you holding above what other principle? What need are you holding above what other need? And, you know, it's a values question, I think.
Mm-hmm. So as long as we're talking about that, there's a comment here. It's not posed as a question, but I know we started out, Anasuya, you were talking about values and also working at how does that play out. So the comment that someone posted was, all boards should be fundraising boards, plus their other responsibilities. And I wanted to point that out because we hear that a lot, that well, some CEOs and boards, that's what they're going after. They're going after the individuals with money. And I can see them say, well, we reached out into the community. We collect, you know, we got these individuals. Well, how do you respond to that? And what I'm looking for specifically is, what's the conversation that you would have with that board chair or CEO who says, we need a fundraising board?
You want to take that?
I do have a little answer to that, which is you know, one of the boards that I have been on in my life was a board that if you volunteered over a period of 4 months for 4 hours a week, you were automatically on the board, and there were 60 of us on the board, and we were all kinds of people. And we ended up at one point getting in trouble because the LEAA was a battered women's shelter. LEAA pulled off like 90% of the funding, gave us 3 months basically to reorganize our funding base. And that group of 60 people, oh my God, did they eat that town up in terms of fundraising. You know, they were able to mobilize so much support over time, and I know, you know, it's an odd, different kind of look for a board, but there were none of us on that board, I don't think, that had any significant amount of money. So it depends what, you know, you can still get money even without getting big chunks of money, you know, from 20 individuals. You might get tiny little chunks of money from, you know, 300 individuals. It's the same money, and one gives you a bigger base than the other does. You know, it depends how you want to conduct yourself, I think. And so I think that, you know, the idea of, you know, every board should be a fundraising board, I don't even think that's real. I mean, I know lots of boards that aren't fundraising boards and where the staff does all the work in terms of fundraising. And, you know, we've got to get over, like, repeating these things to ourselves that we know are not true.
I think it's just equally important to remember that it's easier to raise money in a crisis than it is to build trust and to build engagement in a crisis. And so that's, I think, at the core of how a board should be working or could be working. Vernetta, what's your thought on that?
Well, not all boards are fundraising boards. I would start with that premise. And yes, in many instances, we need for board members to give personally because funders ask for it. But like Ruth said, you know, your $10 or my $10 might be someone else's $100. So recognizing what the individual is really contributing beyond money, what's the potential there, and how does the individual as well as the board, how do they add value? So value, definitely, we need we have to keep the lights on, but there are many ways to add value. So I know we're at time, so I'm not going to put another question out there because they're still coming in.
Well, shall we take one more and risk it? People can leave if they wish.
Well, okay. There was something that was interesting. Earlier on, Ruth, you were talking about board members need something to bond around. And this individual said, isn't that the mission?
One would hope. But, you know, it is a combination of, I think, in every organization, some combination of mission, vision, connection to the community that you're serving, right? And a real fidelity, as Anasuya put it, to that community. And so, yes, people need to, but they need to bond around the mission, but they need to bond around a living out of that mission, of an actuating of that mission. And that's more complex than we make it out to be, I think, because we're interacting with a lot of different kinds of stakeholder groups. And what would you say to that?
Definitely, the mission is important because that's the one thing that I always say really distinguishes us, so being mission-driven. And so having that bond, having the passion, like I showed on the slide, that everyone is looking for, but that can't be the only thing. Those bonding experiences can come in so many different ways. And I even think about the fact that as you were talking about the skills matrix, people tap into, that's why I'm on the board. But I love it when boards are open-minded about it and say, I was with someone about a week ago, and they said, in their organization, when you come on, you can roam from committee to committee for the first 6 months and figure out where you fit in, and what you want to do. They're not automatically going to plug you into something. So the mission is a bonding opportunity, but there are many ways that I think the board members can get to know each other, socialize, and then they'll have other bonding opportunities as well. I just want to note that a number of the questions that are coming up in the Q&A around practices, like who leads the charge, how do you institute term limits. We have a lot of resources on our website. I just want to put that out there, boardsource.org. Nonprofit Quarterly, definitely always writing about all of these issues. So I just wanted to let the participants know that that's why BoardSource is here, to serve the sector, provide really good, I'll say great nonprofit resources that you can access.
Okay, and I'm sure we'll be taking this up again. This is really, this is a collaborative project with you. You know, these practices, because they are different and we all have to experiment with them, they will develop over time, and we'll begin to see models that that look like we could use them. So for those of you that have actually tried something like what we've been discussing today, we would love to hear from you. And to hear about what your experience has been. And we look forward to talking to you again. Maybe the three of us again can do something on this subject. And thank you so much, Anasuya and Vernetta, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody who has been listening to us. And again, we'll get a copy of the webinar to you in 24 hours. We'll also post it on our website. So bye. Thank you so much.